So I think we can start. So thank you all for attending this webinar. I'm Jean-François Scardigli from NextApps, based in Paris. I'm very glad to introduce a new concept, which is zero code, zero role impact data protection for SAP, and also automation classification for data privacy. In the next slide, about the agenda, we will be looking at the traditional limitations of static, mutual, and manual PFCG rules. We'll be covering new concepts of dynamic authorizations, dynamic data level controls, and this will introduce the new approach for no code, no rule impact. And we will be showing concretely in the demonstrations how it looks like within the solution, followed by some Q&A. In the next slides, you see the different people who will be talking today. So we're very happy to have the exceptional speakers from Customer Advisory Group, who kindly hosted this webinar with us. So ladies first, Dina Shaheen, who is a Principal Advisor for Europe, based in Germany. We have James Roski, very early for him. Thank you so much for joining, James, who is the CEO and founder of Customer Advisory Group. And Tony, our head of product management. And I'm Jean-François Scardigli, working for Europe at NextApps. 2 comments on the logistics. The session will be recorded, so in case you want to review later or share, you can. You will get the recording and the link to the recording. And second comment on the logistics, please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A tab. Those will be taken and answered at the end of this meeting. So now I will hand over to Tony for the introductions. Thank you so much.
So one of the challenges, there's multiple challenges in protecting data within SAP, but the main challenge comes with balancing two opposing issues. One is the need to share, and that's for effective collaboration and for efficiency of the business, and balancing that with the need to protect the data. And that's for both competitive reasons in terms of securing intellectual property or financial data or anything else that needs to remain private, as well as complying with government regulations and industry regulations, and that's both for both compliance for legal reasons, as well as to prevent violations or prevent any fines that may handicap the business. So the question really is, how do we allow for the sharing that is necessary while protecting the data, both for business reasons as well as for compliance reasons? So, data protection is complex, and there's a lot of reasons why that's so, and this is also something that is becoming more of an issue as more and more things go online and become virtual. So one of the things that's important is that there are trade secrets that need to be protected, and that can take many forms. Some of that is pricing, some of that is the specific product specifications, how it's made, what are the ingredients that go into it, what are the contracts with suppliers, all of the trade secrets for a business that they don't want to share with their competitors. As things become more global, there's more data, there's more that's being moved around the world. It's going into different systems, different regulation and compliance regimes, and so it's a lot more complex to protect data in all of these different locations and forms that it may take. And so that's both on the customer side when selling to global audiences, as well as working with international suppliers and a globally distributed supply chain. And since things are spread around the world, there's the different protection that's required by different regulatory authorities. There's operating in Europe has different requirements than operating in the U.S. And even within the U.S., there's differences between different geographies, whether there's different laws in California than in other places within the U.S., and as well as in different industries have different regulations and requirements. And with SAP storing all of this data from many organizations, There's a lot of complexity to making sure that the right data is protected in the right way. Um, so so moving on. And so what because of this complexity, one of the risks is that that if using a role-based approach to security and data protection is what we call role explosion. And so here's just an example. I won't talk through all of it, but just as an example, you can see how the number of security roles can multiply greatly within an organization. And so, especially when you go into organizations that have many different functional roles, potentially many different locations and say plants or company codes and or different storage locations, the roles can quickly multiply and become very unwieldy, very it doesn't scale well. And so, so that results in higher maintenance costs, difficulties in monitoring and tracking the compliance with all of these different roles, as well as the more roles that you have and the more there's more surfaces for potential attacks, more potential. Uh, there's more opportunities for there to be issues or for missing certain requirements. Um, so that's one of the things that really benefits going with like a attribute-based access control model versus a role-based access control model. Yep. Now I'll hand it over to James, and he'll talk a little bit about what he sees with customers.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I couldn't agree with you more. We have the great honor of working with hundreds of customers around the world from the customer advisory group perspective, and there seem to be two common themes that we're seeing. The first one is that security organizations are required to do more with less, and unfortunately, there's the second theme of expanding access and compliance and risk data risk requirements and things that are just getting harder to do, and systems are getting more complex, environments are getting more complex, etc. Now the unfortunate part is that if you have those two contrasting things, using the traditional approaches to security like you talked about, such as having thousands of roles that potentially turn into hundreds of thousands of roles in scenarios where you have acquisitions or mergers, joint ventures, so on and so forth within your organizations, it can be very, very overwhelming and involve a ton of work trying to pigeonhole some of these new requirements that you talked about for data protection, utilizing the legacy security approaches that customers have. Case in point, we have organizations and customers that say, you know what, we just bought a new company, and this new company needs to be brought into our existing SAP systems right away. What does that translate into? Well, we have more data coming in, as well as we have a whole bunch of new users coming in with new security requirements. And in those situations, it doesn't just translate to creating a new batch of roles for all the new company codes, et cetera. It also means going in and making sure that your existing security infrastructure also has the proper protection built in. And I call those the security building blocks. So it isn't just about building new security building blocks and that explosion, Tony, that you mentioned. It's also the effort and the precision that is necessary to go in and modify the existing security building blocks to make sure that your other areas of the company or pre-existing areas of your company are protected as well. Now, the unfortunate part is it's not just the work, but the work is associated with tight deadlines as well. We speak with a lot of security organizations where they're told, we have this project to do. You have to create all these new security roles and levels and things, and it needs to be done by the end of the month because that's when everyone needs their access. And if people don't have the right access, they can't do their job. And there's a lot of pressure involved. And sometimes that translates into inconsistent or what I call duct tape solutions of security. I think we've all sometimes otherwise had to make the hard decision or use the term, we'll give them broad access now and then we'll fix it later, right? And unfortunately, those are famous last words where that fix never happens. And what all of that translates into is the potential of risk within your organization of people not having the right access. So we'll go to the next slide. The next component of this is the what I term the need for speed. And this is around security changes, right? I always like to ask customers, how long does it take for users to get their access changed within your company? And the reason I like to focus on this is that when it comes to data protection and the dynamic nature of how security requirements change for compliance, speed is very, very important. Unfortunately, we have some customers out there where it takes not only weeks, but potentially months for people to get their security modified and updated. And you know, there can be a lot of concerns with that from the perspective of, hey, I don't have the right access to do my job and I have to wait for it. But more importantly, when it comes to the new data requirements and policies that Tony was referring to, there needs to be quick reaction, right? If I'm traveling to a country, say, for instance, that has different compliance standards, like he was referring to internationally, my security can't wait, right? It needs to be appropriate for where I am and when I am there, etc. So, with that said, the traditional model of approver based type of I ask for access to be changed, approver makes a decision, so on and so forth, can take too much time. And at the end of the day, we're all here from a security perspective to make sure that users have the right access to do their job, nothing more, nothing less. But now we have to add the new phraseology of also at the right time. Um, I threw this test question in there. I always like to frame it from the perspective of, back in the old days when we were writing math tests. If Frank leaves on a plane to China going 400 miles an hour, blah 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 blah, that's actually the new reality when it comes to security. Is that security needs to dynamically change for people, not when they just have position changes, but also for the protection of data, depending on these new compliance standards around the world. Um, and if they're not changing fast enough and the security is not dynamic enough, that raises some major, major security loopholes. And this is where Next Labs really can solve that problem. And this is why we recommend Next Labs to a lot of our organizations out there, because A, it focuses on making sure that you're not building these huge security infrastructures that might still have holes in them. It allows you to be more efficient as well as be more nimble outside of the traditional security tools that we all use today. And by Next Labs, as well as the traditional security infrastructures working together, it allows customers to really work smarter rather than harder and address those compliance and risk standards that are always evolving and changing at a very rapid rate. So, with that said, Tony, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jamin. Thanks for adding that perspective. I think that makes a lot of what we're talking about much more real. So with all of these challenges that organizations face, and trying to solve those challenges, what we're talking about today is a new approach, we call a no code, no role impact approach, to preventative controls. And so as we mentioned, the requirements are becoming increasingly complex. You've got the combination of different security threats, restrictions on data, regulatory requirements, as well as as James mentioned, like it's a bit of a race to keep up, but and then changes and innovations within the field. So this complexity, as I mentioned before, can lead, if handled with a role-based approach, can lead to role explosion, and which is just not scalable and can't be maintained, or is too high of maintenance costs. So the next generation, or next phase, is what we call attribute-based access control, and that allows you to automate a lot of this protection, and more efficiently manage the security. So so going on to the next slide. So the way that this would work with the dynamic controls is that you have enforcement point, or the policy enforcement point, and that's actually where the policies are applied. But all of that is really driven by what's happening on the back end in real time. So so going to what's shown here on the bottom is the manager, the policy administration point. That's where you would define the policies and define them in uh, based on the attributes of the environment, the users, the data itself. That would all be defined and kept within the policy database to be referred to at when you reach the policy decision points. I mean, that's where you make the decision as to whether to allow access to this data. And so those policies are evaluated in real time and then enforced at the enforcement point. So that's at the point of data request. Um, that's where at the data access layer, that's where you're actually enforcing these policies in real time. And you're doing this evaluation and making the enforcement decision based on the values at the time, or the attribute values at the time of data access. To move- Yep. So some of the benefits of having these dynamic data level controls is that first of all, it really simplifies the process of defining these controls. You don't have to uh, define a policy for every possible permutation. You just define your policy, your access policy, in terms of different attributes that are evaluated at the time of the request. So that makes it much simpler to define and administer those access control policies. That allows the business to be much more agile since they're dynamically defined. Any changes in the attributes are automatically applied, at the next access request. Um, and also reduces the costs of um, both yeah, for regulatory reasons of maintaining compliance with regulations, as well as just keeping your data secure. And then finally, a lot of these are related, but enforcing those data privacy regulations and anonymizing the data where appropriate, that all feeds back into making sure that you are complying with the necessary regulations, um, and um, you're not caught out by any changes or anything that you haven't defined in a previously. So all of this is made much easier by applying the data level controls dynamically at the time of data request. So one with the dynamic application, that then removes the need for excessive roles, or reduces the risk of role explosion. So you can define much simpler policies that define who has access to what data and what resources based on the attributes. And as long as the attributes are kept up to date, and this could be role changes for users or groups that they're in, or the offices they're working out of, or even how updates in government regulations. Um, all of those, once they've been updated, are immediately apply and are dynamically enforced in real time at the time of data access. So you don't need to define new rules. You don't need to reassign. Sorry, you don't need to define new roles. You don't need to reassign roles to users every time there's a change in that would impact their data access privileges. Here's an example of how this would work. And so this is a attribute-driven policy that's been defined. So there's user attributes. This is like their title, their location, their potential citizenship and nationality, what division they work in. There are environmental attributes. So the location of the resource that's being accessed, as well as the location of um, where the access request is coming from, what time of the day, and what device as well. And then there's resource attributes. So this would be how the data is classified, potentially the ECCN, and then also what application it's being requested from. So those can all be taken together, and we have an example here of allowing just a manager is a U.S. citizen, access to this data during their specific working hours and their specific office location. And then you can define which actions they are allowed to perform. So you can say that this particular user is allowed to just view view the data, or maybe they are allowed to create um, new data objects or change the data objects as well, depending on how the policy is defined. Um, so, um, so now I believe I'll be turning it over to Dina, and she'll go through some specific use cases and how these get applied to um, in the real world. Dina?
In this session, I would like to cover the filtering of authorizations in SAP systems. I have a lot of customers who have, for example, hundreds of sales organizations or organizational units which are just where they have a lot of entities. And certainly for the sales organizations, to give an example, these customers do not want to derive all their sales roles to all the sales organizations, to hundreds of them every time. So they are looking for an easier way where they can maintain the data more easily and make sure that people only have access to the sales organization they're supposed to have. So Next Labs offers the option to filter the data a user can see, change, or create in an SAP system with the filtering option. What I want to show first is how a general user without filtering option can go into the SAP system and see all data. So this user right now, demo user 02, does not have any restrictions. The user can, for example, let's go into change sales orders and select any change order, a sales order they want. And I'm just trying to look into sales organization 1000 right now. So we see here 3 entries which are found. User can select them. And change the sales orders for sales organization 1000 in this case. Back one step. Let's look for another sales order in sales organization 0001. Go to this one. Also, user can change sales orders from sales organization 0001. So what we saw right now, this user with general access can, for example, change sales orders from sales organization 1000 as well as from sales organization 0001. Now set up a user with restricted access. That user has also the same roles and authorizations that the other user had. Say the same profile, sub all, sub new, really huge authorizations. And this is not how it should go in the backend system, but just to show you that there is no restriction on organizational levels. The other restriction we have with this user is that this user is right now in department 0001. So we set up the filtering where we said, first of all, we define a resource. What do we want to filter? And what I want to filter is table ABAC, because that is the underlying table behind transactions to create, change, or display sales orders. So here in the resource, I only define the table, the text, description, and condition, the table is BBAK. Once that is done, I've defined the resource on which I want to restrict access. I define people who can have access to that resource. In this case, I choose department is 0001. I select the users from department 001 with the condition that the department in SAP that I just showed you in the user master record is 0001. And then I combine the subject and the resource in the policy where I set up a filtering for the table BBAK, where I set the subject, so should be in department 0001, which I defined before. And the table resource is in the component table BBAK, which I also defined before. And certainly what I need to do is then also to define the restrictions. The restrictions I defined is that VK org in this case should be 0001. Only when this is given, the user will be restricted. The user who is in the department 0001 will be restricted on the sales organization 0001 in table BBAK. How does this look for the user? I've shown the user I've shown you the user demo user SD1 before, who's restricted on sales organization 0001. Now I'm going to log on as this user. I also want to change sales order. I execute transaction the A02. And then I'll look at the purchase order, sales orders in sales organization 1000. So because I have the restriction on sales organization 0001 only, I can see no values for this selection for sales organization 1000. I want to see sales orders for sales organization 0001. And the 5 entries we saw before with the other user are coming up here too. I can select one, search for it, open it, and change it again. So with the filtering of the table BBAK, I can restrict people to be only able to access a certain sales organization, in this case 0001, without setting up derived roles for hundreds of sales organizations. One issue companies have a lot is restricting people on access to fields that are not organizational values or do not even have an authorization check, an underlying authorization check in a transaction. I'm going to go into purchase orders right now, and we'll just select a purchase order. And we can see the different fields in the purchase order now. And we know that We don't have a restriction on purchase order, the number itself. We can set up restrictions for vendors, but definitely we have restrictions for the order type and other items here. I just want to select right now because we have a restriction for order type already in the current authorizations concept that SAP delivers. I want to choose a field where we have no authorization check on. For example, like currency, in this case, it's US dollars. And why do I want to select this field? Without next steps, if we wanted to restrict on a certain field where no authorization check is given by SAP, it would have to create a modified SAP transaction with authorization checks inserted by developers. And then we have to test everything and just to make sure that everything is working fine, create our own authorization object, eventually insert it and make sure that we have the right authorizations then in the roles too. So with next step, that is not required anymore. You can authorize people or restrict the authorizations of people to fields which do not have an authorization check, but are visible in the application, like the currency right now. So now, right now I have a couple of purchase orders here. This is 29 with US dollar currency. I just go back and want to select more purchase orders. And when you scroll down, you see I have 55 purchase orders that I found here. So I'm going to look in the next one into 45 others. And here we have the currency PTE. And I think I want to restrict the next user on the currency PTE. So what I did is I set up filtering of the table EKKO, which is underlying or behind the transaction to change a purchase order, create a purchase order. And as shown before, I have to define the table first as a resource. In next steps, I just define the table. Further down, the table is EKKO. So that's the table we want to do restrictions on. And then I have to define the subjects or the users in this case. And I just say the department is PTE. I select the user type. And in this case, I say the department SAP is PTE. That is only because I don't have right now other values to restrict on than SU01 data of the user ID. I set up the policy with the subject and the resource. Altered the filter of AKKO and said the subjects that are affected are all users who have department PTE. Resource components is the table EKKO on a certain system. I can also restrict it on multiple systems or leave that out. And then I define the filtering condition, which is that the field WAERS, that's the currency field, in the table EKKO is PTE. Going to log out with this user. And I'm going to log in with a user who has a restriction on currency PTE. It would be demo user P01. So with the other user we saw who has no restriction at all, that this user can access 55 purchase orders. Let's see what this user here can do. Go to the purchase order again. I'm just going to select the purchase orders without any filtering. If I scroll down, I see that this user only has 29 entries found. I'll look at the purchase order we had before. The one with the type EC and number ending with 29. That isn't even shown here because it has the currency US dollars. If I go and select this purchase order, for example, I can see that this user is able to access all purchase orders where the currency is PTE. So without having set up any coding in the SAP system, without having a field like currency as an organizational field in the roles, or any field where I can restrict access to a user in the SAP authorization concept, with the filtering provided by Next Labs, I can still filter the users to access only certain data that I could never restrict that easily with the SAP authorization concept. Also, for very small organizations, using Next Labs is very practical. For example, if you're a small organization in a certain location, a small purchasing organization, for example, and you want people there to be able to create and maintain purchase orders, but also to be able to release the purchase orders. However, you just want to make sure that people do not release the purchase order that they created or maintained themselves. And certainly there are organizational restrictions that you could apply. You could set up controls. You could also start to work on a workflow that makes sure that if somebody creates or maintains a purchase order, the release is done by a different person. However, that requires some coding, interaction, changing the SAP standard. And instead of doing that, you can set up a policy in Next Labs to make sure that people cannot release the purchase order that they created or maintain themselves. Right now, I'm in an SAP system logged on as the demo user who has wide access. And I just want to show you how that would work. I go to table, for example, SE16 to table echo, and look at all the purchase orders that are in the system. And here we see a lot of purchase orders which have been created by a user named Düngelhof. So I would like to make sure that this user does not release or approve his own purchase orders. And right now with the demo user 02 that I have, I can go into the release of the purchase orders and select the purchase orders I want to release. And because I still have wide access for this demo user, I can select up to 55 entries, open purchase orders, and certainly also the purchase order that was created by the user Düngelhof. I'm going to log out of the system with demo user 02. I will now log on as the user Düngelhof. Now, for example, with this user ID, who is not able to see or release their own data, when we go to the table echo and execute it. Okay, I've now logged in as user Dummelhof, and I'm going to S16 first, check the table entries in the table echo. I'm just going to want to see all the table entries. And right now, I don't see any table entries with my name Dummelhof here. Just gonna scroll a little bit down. And I go now to 28 to approve some purchase orders. And when I want to select the purchase orders, scroll down and I only find 40 entries. So I do not find the other 15 entries that I created myself. I also do not find the purchase order, for example, that we just looked at, the NB, with zeros at the end. That is not in there because I created or maintained that purchase order myself. So how did we do that? We set up a new filtering rule in Next Labs. We said we're going to restrict the data of the table EKKO to those people who did not create a purchase order themselves, so only the user himself can will be affected. We're looking at table EKKO. When we go further down, we see that now we have a more complex SQL queries to set up to make sure that all the purchase orders are selected, that were not created by the user himself or herself that is logging on. This is how we restrict the access then for very small organizations, so that a user who executed one activity is not able to execute the following activity. The organization is very small.
Thank you so much, Dina, for those great 3 use cases. We have a few questions. First, so that I will be going through. One question for James. Is this approach complementary to the PFCG rules and to the GSE access control, or does it replace them?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. To be very direct, the answer is no, it's not a replacement. You know, good security using the authorization concept as well as your compliance processes and maybe even compliance applications, including SAP GRC, are still absolutely essential. Next Labs is there to augment and enhance and provide additional flexibility to really make that security structure better, stronger, and more nimble. So, you know, to get directly to the answer to the question, no, Next Labs is something that supplements, complements, and helps, you know, that existing foundation of good security and good compliance, and kind of takes it to the next level.
Thank you, James. Second question, maybe for you, James, again. For our ODCC, we need to still implement new controls while limiting investments in new roles, custom code, testing of roles, and custom codes. Can this approach be used then to achieve this while minimizing new investments on ECC?
Yeah. Well, this is something what a lot of customers are facing right now, right? Especially with the new programs of like Rise and going to some of the new cloud technologies, but still needing to focus on maintaining that existing infrastructure that you've relied on for years and will need to rely on for quite a while during that transition to these newer technologies. And the last thing you want to do is throw a whole bunch of money at fixing a problem in an old system that might be kind of throw away of that investment if you're going to be transitioning to a new technology shortly. But on the flip side, you still need to be compliant and you still need to serve those security purposes. So long story short is the answer is yes. Even in some of the examples that Dina showed in her use cases, Next Labs was able to go and fix that problem or address that security concern in a way that didn't require you going and putting together a project and getting ABAPers involved. A simple thing like Dina showed, like filtering of information in the tables, or even that currency example, those aren't supported through standard authorizations, right? That you can just simply go in and build new roles. That actually would involve customization in the traditional model if you weren't using Next Labs. And that would be the code that you would have to, put into your old ECC system that might not be, valuable in the future once you transition to that new technology. But if you noticed, Dina was able to do it with, a matter of clicks in Next Labs. There was no code necessary. There was no development. There was no, formal project to identify all the requirements and technical specs and all that stuff. She was actually able to build it on the fly during the demo. And that is significant because in a traditional model of extending security to look at currencies, which is not a traditional authorization object value in that case, that would take a long time and potentially a lot of internal resources or even external resources to facilitate that. And Next Labs was able to do it through just basic configuration. So long story short is that through the utilization of not only good security, good compliance, but also the augmentation of some of the stuff that Next Labs brings to the table, you're able to address those security challenges now, even in an ECC system, capitalize on your investment, and not have to worry about throwing money away if you're transitioning, to a future infrastructure or different processes, compared to the traditional model of development and things along that line, which we had to do in the old days before applications like Next Labs actually existed.
Thank you, James. And I have a very concrete example in Europe. It's a big pharmaceutical company that actually chose our solution from Next Labs for S/4HANA originally, but they found out pretty recently that they will be using this technology for ECC in order to minimize the investment. They want to minimize investments in ECC. So that's exactly the case from this customer, that the plan was to use only for S4, but actually the short-term plan will be at ECC in order to solve some new business requirements for data protection, but with very low investment and without touching the code, the roles, without testing the roles, which would be obviously bigger projects. There is another question, maybe for Dina. For S/4HANA, and because we are highly regulated, our policy is becoming more strict to avoid custom codes. Is this what this approach is about?
Yeah, exactly. And I would say it's not only about policy, it's about, the policies within the companies or outside the companies when it comes to regulation. It's also about how do you want to handle custom code in the future. And I have a lot of customers, and I've had a lot of customers who have a lot of custom-made authorization objects, custom coding in the transactions or programs. And these codings and enhancements are so old that these guys don't even remember where they're coming from and what the purpose was. So what I like about Next Labs is, and I don't want to sound too advertisement like, but what I like about is that we do not even go into the coding. We don't have to worry about the different parts, like I need to set up an authorization object and need to document that somewhere and insert it in the coding and document that somewhere too. And somehow also make sure that the whole documentation is, kept. And when you want to remove something, you know exactly where to remove what and everything. That is a very complex task. And now we can set up everything in one solution, Next Labs, at one place, where we also have great fields where we can set up the whole documentation. Why do we filter on certain fields? Why do we have this restriction in place? So it's not only from the policy standpoint, but also about how do you want to handle the coding that you implement today in the future? How you want to handle it in, let's say, 5 years or so, when you don't have a clue what's going on? Actually, the developers have gone, and even if they're still in the company, they might not even remember what they did when. And you know, I think it's Next Labs is a very good solution to implement at a central place restrictions that you want to have, and don't worry about the documentation, keeping documentation up to date outside of this Next Lab system.
Great, thank you, Dina. One question which I may take: can the data protection policies protect cross applications beyond SAP, since we don't have only SAP ECC or S4HANA in our IT transformation? So the simple answer is yes, policies are cross applications. 2 examples I can give you in Europe: AXA, over 40 different applications, and most of them are actually not SAP. Second example, Airbus, 22 applications, most of them are non-SAP, but all managed with the same externalized policies, so independent from the application. Last question, DLP and DRM question: how do you protect files created by the applications within the applications and beyond the application? So yes, we didn't talk too much about this. This is also manageable by policies with the same policy engine. We can also protect block save as, so block extracting from SAP, for example, so block the action from SAP. But if the user is allowed, if he wants to save on his personal laptop or somewhere dangerous, we can also encrypt the data so that this data will be protected not only in his laptop, but when he sends his files to China or wherever he wants to send his file, this will be protected with a DRM. So it's both DLP, blocking access, download, and DRM at the same time. We can do both. So I'm conscious on the time. I think we are done with the questions. I want to thank you warmly for attending. This session is recorded, so you should get the recording, the link to the recording, and please feel free to reach to us for any further questions. Thank you so much, and have a good day.